thank you for doing this. You're down here from cold Vermont to cold Georgia.
I am, and that introduction way overly generous.
Okay, I'd never do it again.
All right,
I promise. As I mentioned to the students, we're going to record your oral history later, but I thought it would be helpful for the students if you could just real briefly kind of introduce yourself and kind of give them the arc of your career briefly, because we got a lot to talk about, but I think they are entitled to know who they're listening to.
Okay. Well, let's see, I went to Duke undergraduate, and I was on a Navy scholarship, and so when I got out of Duke, I rode the Navy 6 years, 4 years of active service, 2 years of reserve. I didn't like going to the Navy because I got seasick, so I went to the Marine Corps instead. Can't hear?
All right, we're just going to have to cut the table mic and project.
Okay, I'll try. So anyhow, I got out of Duke. I went into the Marine Corps. I went to Vietnam, came back. I was stationed as a training officer down in Albany, Georgia. It was time for me to get out of the Marine Corps, and I said, all right, what am I going to do now? I had no idea what I was going to do. I said, well, I've seen two things. I was an undergraduate student at Duke, and I was a Marine in Vietnam. Which of those is better? I'm going back to school. So I went back to school, went to law school at the University of Georgia on a different kind of scholarship. And then when I graduated from Georgia, I practiced in Gainesville for a while. It was in the general legal services practice setting. And I got a fellowship to go to what was then Antioch Law School. And this was a real boom for me because Antioch Law School at that time was an all clinical law school. You started representing clients the day you got to law school. So I was hired in under this fellowship as a director of a clinic. It was a consumer law clinic, and working with students in representing clients, again, from the moment that they got there on. Because of that, the question of what does it mean to be a good lawyer and how do you get there was right on the surface. You couldn't avoid dealing with it. So I was at Antioch for 2 years on the fellowship. Antioch then hired me on for another year. And I then went out on the market and got a job here directing clinical programs. And I did that for 5 years, became associate dean, and hired in people to replace me, and then went into the classroom, focused primarily on legal ethics. Not just legal ethics, but primarily legal ethics. I did that for a very long time. In addition to legal ethics, I was teaching evidence and trial practice and a variety of things along the way. And then as I tell people, I got really sick of being ethical. And so I went into First Amendment, and for the last part of my teaching career, my primary emphasis was on law and religion and freedom of speech. I retired. I was here 35 years, and I retired, continued to write, continued to speak, but no longer do any teaching. So this is the first time I've been in the classroom quite a while. And as recently as 7 or 8 days ago, I was out in the woods of Vermont in the snow. So you'll forgive me if there's a bit of a culture shock here and being surrounded by 180 people, when in Vermont, I don't see 180 people in a year. No.
Well, Jack, you talk about this question of what it means to be a good lawyer. You and I both know that's really what this class is about. This class was originally your idea. And I'm wondering if you could talk to the students a little bit about why you thought it was so important that first-year law students, in a systematic way, examine and reflect on this question of what it means to be a good lawyer.
Yeah. Well, let me give you a little bit about the idea for the course, and I'll answer the question. While I was at Antioch, I approached the question how does one become a good lawyer in a very particular way. It was a very analytical way. We divided lawyering tasks up into competencies and sub-competencies, came up with a system of analysis that would allow professors to examine any student's performance in any lawyering task and evaluate it. So you could compare a performance in trial with a performance in counseling and so forth, because they all involve some set or subset of these competencies. And I wrote about that, and it made a bit of a splash, and some schools started adopting that as their system for evaluating clinics and even for designing curriculums and the like. And after a while, I decided that that wasn't the way to go, and started thinking about it again, and thinking about it more in terms of what does it mean to be a professional? What does it mean? What does professionalism mean? And I wrote a book about that, and it focused on a particular ideal. The ideal was meaningful participation, providing clients with meaningful participation. And I thought at the time that you could understand all of legal ethics by just understanding that as the ideal of what you're doing, as professional ideal. A service to that ideal is sufficient for professionalism and all of the ethics of the practice. Well, that book got some attention too, and especially got the attention of a couple of Supreme Court justices at the time, and the Chief Justice, Harold Clark, from the Georgia Supreme Court. And they asked me to come up there to talk about what could be done within law schools to turn students into good lawyers, yes, but their focus was almost entirely on this word professionalism. They saw it declining in the practice, and Charlie Weltner was the other justice who was most concerned about this, and so they were really asking for some suggestions. And that's what prompted me. I came back and said, all right, and came up with the idea of the course. Well, I took it back to them, and they liked the idea. And Weltner, this was typical Weltner, if you ever knew the man, he said, okay, well, we're going to make this a requirement for all law schools in Georgia. I said, no, don't do that. You really can't do that. If they had done that, I would have been the arch enemy of every law professor in Georgia, because they just don't like courts dictating to them what their curriculum is going to be and so forth and so on. So he backed off. And I said, just give us a chance, said Mercer, to try this out. And we did. We tried it in several ways. I did it most of the years. John Cole did it some years. Others did it some years. Never worked particularly well until Pat Longden took over and made sense out of what we were trying to do. And so the final form, of course, the form that it is in now, almost entirely Pat's work. He keeps giving me credit for it, but it's his. Okay, so back to why was that important? Well, I wanted to make more conscious for students what was happening to them within their 3 years of law school, and then into practice as well. I thought that making that a more conscious thing would assist both in their understanding what it meant to become a good lawyer, and their own involvement in that process of becoming a good lawyer. So the initial thought was, let's make this more reflective than it's been. For the most part, it had been students would go to the courses like you go to, torts, contracts, criminal procedure, so forth and so on, and notice that, at least in the first year, none of those courses do clients really appear. The focus is almost entirely on opinions and on the law and the like. You can't make sense out of what it means to practice law if you divorce it from the context of the representation of clients and the like. And so we need to think about that. We need to think about what you're doing in those courses in terms of how is that shaping you towards being a good lawyer and so forth. And then also that there's an intellectual component to it that doesn't come naturally to people. So I wanted to bring that to the fore as well. But the central problem was this. Most students, I think, tend to divorce themselves from what they're doing in law school. It's a natural thing to do. You have a personal identity, and you notice yourself being shaped by law school, and that's okay, but you resist it and hold on to who you are. At least that's what you think you're doing. So I'm really the person I am on the weekend, and during the week I do this law stuff, and that carries on into practice, and you divide up your world that way. Well, when you do that, not only does it harm yourself, you become two selves, and they're sometimes at war against each other, and it looks to be an insurmountable problem. But you also take what the practice of law needs away from it, because what it needs is all of those things that you thought of as within your personal identity. So the trick was to find a way for students to, I use a fancy word here, to appropriate the tradition of our practice, and in the course of appropriating it, to be appropriated by it. That kind of adjustment to it, where you make the practice your own, but it's still the practice. Does that make sense?
Well, Jack, one of the, it's no secret that we talk about virtue, we use that term explicitly. No secret that approach to all of this is based upon the concept of virtue ethics, which I know goes back a long way. That is because of your influence on me. So you're to blame for that as well. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to the students about what this concept of virtue ethics means, where it comes from.
Right.
And then we've got some terms we want to make sure everybody understands.
Right, okay. Well, it goes back a long way. It goes back to Aristotle. And it was a dominant form of ethics through most of our history. Changed over time. I won't tell you all that story because we don't have time for it. But it occurred to me that, and this goes back to the first question that Pat asked, that the crucial thing for the kind of examination I was looking for in this proposed course was not what you could do when you got out of law school, but who you became, okay? That there was a divide there. That, yeah, you can acquire skills and knowledge and other components of the learning, but the crucial thing was, who did you become? And that would really determine whether the practice was going to be meaningful for you, and whether or not your decision to become a lawyer would end up over the long term to have been a good one. So that was a crucial component. And that was something that couldn't be completed in law school, but really had to begin, and had to begin in a conscious way. Well, if you start talking about who are you going to become, it naturally lends itself to virtue ethics. Why? Well, for Aristotle, virtue ethics had to do with, again, another fancy word, with a teleology, which means that there was an ideal towards which people were headed in their lives, an ideal type of person towards which you were headed. For him, it was the Athenian gentleman. And that's sexist because it excludes ladies from the gentleman part, and it was sexist at the time. He was only talking about men. Such was the nature of the world at the time. So for men, it was the Athenian gentleman. That was the ideal form of life, the form of life that provided another Greek term, eudaimonia, which translated happiness, but that's a bad translation because it's a particular form of happiness. It means the happiness of a life well lived, which in the final analysis of it, you can only know in looking back upon your life whether or not it was a life well lived. So the Athenian gentleman was the way to get there, and the Athenian gentleman had certain qualities about him, and you wanted to acquire these qualities. Well, he divided those qualities up into virtues, things like honesty, courage, generosity, and so forth. And they're for the most part, these were those that enabled you to maintain what we would now call centering, where you were centered. You remain the kind of person you are through all of the troubles of one's life. The virtues were those things that moved you in the direction of accomplishing that ideal, and the vices were the things that moved you away from it. So by being courageous, you could, the virtue of courage, you could become more like the Athenian gentleman. And by being timid, you would become less like the Athenian gentleman. And it was a nice, neat way of making sense out of ethics. A way that, in the general sense of it, is there an ideal form of life out there for people now? No, we could never agree upon that. We would never agree upon what are the qualities of the Athenian gentleman now. The world is too fragmented for that now. But for him, at the time, it worked, because it was an ideal that emerged from the culture. Everyone could say, yeah, that's right, that's the kind of person we want to be. And you can make sense out of ethics that way.
So you have a telos, which is the end or the ideal.
Right.
Virtues take you towards the telos. Vices take you away from it.
Exactly.
All that, of course, presupposes agreement on the ideal, and we need to get there in just a minute.
Right.
There's one other concept here that we've talked about before, and has actually come up in some of the discussions with the students so far, and that is the notion of the middle way. Yeah. Right. And excess of virtue. Right. And so on. Could you talk about that just a little bit?
Sure.
And we'll talk about what the ideal means.
Sure. Well, one thing immediately is the middle way is not a calculation. It's not, here's one extreme, here's the other, let's find the way in the middle. So it's kind of a misnomer to say it's the middle way. Best way to do it, I think, would be to take, let's take courage, the one that we were talking about. The excess of courage is foolhardiness, right? You can see that in the Olympics. There are certain tricks that you might try in snowboarding that are simply foolhardy. It's crazy to do that. And there are other tricks that, yeah, you can do, but you're not going to get any points for it. So the one would be foolhardy, the other would be timid. And you're looking for something in between there. And just as it would in snowboarding, it requires a judgment about it. It requires finding exactly that right place in between those two extremes and calling that place courage. That's true of all the virtues. Generosity, you can see, there's an extreme of generosity, there is a lack of generosity, and finding the right place requires a judgment. All the virtues require that judgment in order to be virtues. And what he called that virtue, and it then becomes the central virtue, is practical wisdom, a term I think you probably already heard here. So every virtue is going to require that kind of judgment. Here's the circular part of it. In order to acquire practical wisdom, you have to start the process of acquiring each one of these virtues. This practical wisdom is like the culmination. You can't really do it well until you've already acquired all these virtues. And is that circular? Yes. His answer to that was, sure it is, but take it step by step.
I think we can do some concrete examples for the students based upon some of the things that they've already done.
Okay.
But I want to switch to this question of the ideal. I mean, you say, I think quite correctly, that no, we couldn't agree today on one ideal.
Right.
And as part of learning to be a good lawyer, we substitute something for that. We substitute the ideal lawyer as defined by the legal profession.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that and how we get there and how you envision what that ideal is. I mean, students are learning a particular set of definitions. You know what that is.
Right.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the ideal lawyer in the 21st century and where that comes from and why we define it that way.
Okay, well that came about through reading a book by Alistair McIntyre. Got a great deal of attention for this. They don't read the excerpt.
No, they haven't read McIntyre.
Yeah. And what he said was that, wait a minute, there's a form of Aristotle for our time that does work. And it is within something called practices. Now, fortunately, we already referred to what we do as lawyers as within practice. But he had a technical definition of practice, and so there are certain practices, medical practice, legal practice, obviously, but there are other kind of practices as well. There's a practice of being a bricklayer, for example. And he said, if you stop thinking about this in terms of an entire life and a human ideal and so forth and so on, if you avoid what he would refer to as Aristotle's naturalism, that is, that there's a natural way we are supposed to be, that's what's gone from us. Instead, looked at it within practices, you will find that in good practices, this Aristotelian notion of ideal remains, that each practice will carry with it an understanding of the ideal practitioner. Okay, so the question was, and it's Pat's question, how do you go about that seemed right to me, and it seemed to match my own experience in practice. There are certain lawyers that everyone within the practice of law admired. And actually, I could stop right there, because in many ways, that then, in true Aristotelian fashion, is definitional of the ideal, of becoming that kind of person. But we couldn't just leave it at that. It's possible to leave it at that. And part of what you do in this course by reading about practitioners and examining their lives and having people like Doc Snyder came in the other day, who are wonderful lawyers, come in and so forth. Part of it is in that process of learning that ideal in that way. But I thought you could make it more conscious than that, more self-reflective than that, and start identifying what we mean by the ideal lawyer, realizing that it's going to change over time and that you will change it as well. It's not a given. It's not that you have to be like this. It's that this is something that you admire and you'll make it your own. That's that appropriation stuff. You can't become exactly like that person, but you can become your version of it, and in the process, change what that ideal is. So that was the idea, that there are ideals within the practice, and that then gives us a sensible way of understanding what the virtues are and what the vices are. And you start looking around within the practice itself to determine what that ideal is. It's an ongoing conversation, a constant conversation within the practice itself. And in many ways, what you're doing in this course is entering that conversation. A simple way of, analogous way of understanding that is that there's an ideal of character within baseball. Pat and I are both, how would you describe it?
Baseball guys.
Baseball guys. There's something about baseball. There's an ideal of character within baseball. It's ongoing. At one time, the idea that you could steal a base was seen as a horrible thing. Absolutely horrible thing in baseball. The first time people started stealing bases, the response of the practice was the pitcher would turn around, throw at the person as hard as they could as they were stealing the base, completely defenseless. Soon, there was a conversation then within baseball as to whether or not stealing the base is good for baseball or not. And they decided, well, what are the virtues? They didn't do it in these terms. I can't imagine Chipper Jones using the word virtue. But that's what they were doing. What are the virtues that are required in order to steal a base? They started examining that and determined that, well, damn, those are things that we admire in baseball. So maybe we should incorporate this. Maybe this should become part of baseball, and we then start shaping this ideal of what it is to be a good ball player. So, yeah, let me mention one other thing. Notice that one of the virtues there of a good ball player is forgetting the play. The play that you just screwed up, to get that out of your mind as quickly as you can so you're ready for the next play. Well, that's a particular virtue of baseball. one that's very useful in other settings, but particularly um, uh, useful in baseball, important in baseball for being fair. So that's the idea. Yeah.
Taking it back to what they have learned so far, this notion of taking the ideal from the practice itself. I've given them 5 virtues: competence, fidelity to the client, fidelity to the law, civility, and practice in the spirit of public service. Those came from the practice. They came from the codes and creeds that came out in the late 1980s, one of which you wrote,
right,
as statements by the practice of what the ideal was.
Right.
And then that's my distillation of it. You've seen that.
Right.
Wondering if you wouldn't mind commenting on that set of virtues and tell me where I'm wrong, tell me what I'm missing, tell the students how you see that ideal differently or in addition to what they've learned from me.
Okay. Don't think you're wrong. I think I want to put a whole lot of footnotes to what you've said, though. So, for example, the ideal of fidelity to clients, which is crucial, and then the ideal of fidelity to law, both of those require the classical virtues. You cannot be faithful to clients or faithful to law without honesty, courage, generosity, so forth and so on. You can't do it. Now, if Pat were to try to list all of those virtues, it would be overwhelming to you. And so the summary of fidelity to client is a good one. But you can't see that in the abstract because fidelity to client requires a certain kind of honesty, a certain kind of courage. And fidelity to the law, you're going to see this right away in practice, that fidelity to the law requires courage. And it's not just courage generally, it's a unique kind of courage. And it's not just honesty, something that we often don't associate with lawyers, and yet the practice demands more honesty of lawyers than is demanded of us in our ordinary lives. You will find it much easier to lie in other settings than in the practice of law. The world doesn't realize that, but it's true. And it's a particular kind of honesty. So you might be a risk of losing out on that and thinking of just fidelity to client, fidelity to law. And those two, by the way, do not need to be in tension with each other. They can be, but they do not need to be in tension at all. The other thing that I would say is that pastoralism starts off with this notion of competence. And that too is a useful summary of a lot of things, but it's problematic because you can't be competent at the practice of law without having these other virtues. You can't do it. The kind of work you are doing in your other courses, believe it or not, require certain virtues. They require particularly the virtues that are all captured in the notion of fidelity to law. The way in which you read cases is not just a matter of acquiring a simple skill that can be used for any purpose. It too requires a whole set of those virtues. And by learning to read those cases well, you start moving yourself in that direction. So this course is intimately integrated with what you're doing in the other courses. Some of the virtues that are assumed in that notion of competency are what we might call intellectual virtues of a particular kind. Let me see if I make sense of that. Imagine that you are watching, you're behind a one-way glass. You can look through, people can't see you, and you're watching a round table. They're gathered there, a lawyer, an architect, a philosopher, a doctor, a politician, an engineer, so forth and so on. They've all been gathered to discuss some general problem that the city is facing, okay? And you watch this conversation. You don't know who these people are. You've never seen them before. You don't know what their roles are, what their jobs are, and so forth. You, right now, second semester law students, would be able to identify which one is the lawyer. And if you ask yourself how you could do that, you know you could do it, but how you could do that, you'll start seeing that there are certain ways of thinking that lawyers acquire. So, for example, lawyers have the ability to hold competing thoughts in their mind at one time. Lawyers have the ability to anticipate what the argument is going to be on the other side of the issue. You have to do that in order to be persuasive. You got to know what you are responding to. And in order to do that, you have to be able to appreciate what the position is on the other side. Lawyers have a particular concern about the conversation. There's this obsession with it being fair, with all the voices being heard and so forth and so on. There's a range of intellectual virtues that you are acquiring in the other courses and in this one as well that are identifiable things. And if you were sitting there observing these people, you'd say, well, I believe that one is the lawyer. And you'd be doing that on the basis of those virtues. So I wouldn't want you to, here's what the problem is. You could think, well, what I'm doing in the other courses and what he means by competence or skills and so forth and so on, and you can do those things and you can do them ethically or not ethically. You can do them for good or evil. That's not virtue talk. That's a different kind of ethics. It's Kantian ethics. In virtue talk, you cannot do those tasks. You cannot do a good job of counseling. You cannot do a good job as a trial lawyer. You cannot even do a good interview with a client without those virtues. Because what it means to do a good job includes the notion of doing it with those virtues.
Okay. I want to focus on one thing that you've already mentioned, but it's a big thing, and that is the so-called master virtue, practical wisdom.
Right.
In a particular circumstance, a particular set of complex facts, all the complexity of the world brings us as lawyers. You have all these virtues you've talked about, many more than I even mentioned, in play, and you're trying to find the right mix, the middle way, so-called, of all those virtues in a particular circumstance.
Right.
Over the next 4 weeks, the students are going to be doing a series of exercises that are explicitly exercises in practical wisdom,
right,
and trying to make decisions and make recommendations. And they're reading some things about practical wisdom to understand more about the basics of it. You talk with them just a little bit about more about what practical wisdom is, how you learn to do it, how you recognize it when you see it, what its role is for a lawyer.
Yeah, that's a
big question.
Yeah, that's a big question. It's very difficult. Practical wisdom remains one of those things that is somewhat mysterious to us, not because we can't puzzle it out, although we can't, but because its nature is mysterious. It honestly is mysterious. Let me give you a simple way of thinking about it, and I'll try to get to Pat's question, knowing that I can't answer it. You already know, particularly within your smaller sections, that there are certain people within your class that you would go to with problems. You already know that. There are certain people that it may be friend, often is, but even among your friends, there's certain friends that you would go to with problems, and certain friends you might not do that. You might be curious of what they would say, but there's someone that you would go to. But why do you go to that person? What is it about that person? Well, that thing is a practical wisdom. That person somehow has acquired the ability to know what the right thing to do is at the right time and for the right reason. Not generally. I'm not talking about, you wouldn't go to someone for a theory about this, but that person in the particular circumstances, and that's crucial, particular factual situation, be able to help you see what's the right thing to do at the right time for the right reason. That's really a way of understanding what we mean by practical wisdom. And what Aristotle said is that you acquire it by observing other people. He said it again in a circular way. You acquire it by watching people who already have it. Yeah, Aristotle, or Archie, we can call you. But how would I know that that person has it when I don't know what it is yet? And he would again say, well, step by step. Sort of like the way that you might acquire an appreciation of classical music. You start off and you hear it, and it all sounds very much alike. And you start appreciating differences among different pieces and the like. You start seeing things that are of value and hearing things that are of value. And over time, you suddenly know and appreciate. It's very much a similar process, he would say. Now, I think, and I think Pat thinks, that you can make that process more conscious. There are various ways of thinking about it that will speed you along in the process rather than just observing other people. There are things to be looking for and the like. I tried in a little piece to identify the elements. Many people have done this, but to identify the elements of practical wisdom. And I can refer you to that if it would help. But I think I'm going to leave it at that. And that is to say that in some sense you already know what it is. Now let's go think about it more carefully.
And as you think about doing this step by step, the students.
But let me interrupt if you don't mind. No. By the way, that notion of practical wisdom is why you lawyers, good ones, are damn well worth $200 an hour. It may be the only reason that they are worth $200 an hour. The ones that you go to for that kind of counseling, or that kind of judgment about how to proceed, or that kind of judgment with a particular jury, that is rare, valuable thing, and justifies your $500,000 salaries, in my mind.
The lawyer who can answer the question, what should I do?
Yeah.
Not what could I do. As we think about the students starting this process and learning how to do it and reflecting on it, they're going to have these problems. I think they are of increasing complexity as we go over the next few weeks. One of the things they can do, of course, is to look at the problem. They're enrolled, they're immersed in the situation, they have a question to answer. They ought to be able now to identify the virtues in play, the lawyerly virtues in play, and to begin to see the tensions among them and
Right.
they're trying to find the right balance of the virtues in a particular circumstance, and then trying to make a decision or a recommendation. Is that the kind of thing you mean by step for somebody who's never consciously engaged in this process?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. You can also do it more generally in conversations with other people when you start thinking about those conversations in the lawyer character that you're now acquiring. You can do it when you watch politicians on television or commentators. You already started doing that. You started thinking about them as a lawyer might and exercising those intellectual virtues. You always know already that there's a good argument on the other side of every argument you hear, and that the question is going to be a judgment. It's always going to be a judgment about these competing good arguments. And there may be good arguments that are entirely left out of the conversation, and you already know that. So when you start thinking in those terms, yes, thinking about those in terms of particular lawyering tasks and the like, but you can think about it more generally. Again, don't want you dividing up your world into here's a lawyer world and here's a person world. You're becoming a particular kind of person. And in the process, I mean, you are becoming a particular kind of person in the process of going through law school. And the underlying theme of this course, as I understand it, is an examination of that. Is that a good thing? Is this going to be a meaningful life? wait a minute, I liked who I was before I came to law school. I don't see any reason to change, and so forth and so on. I am changing. Is this a good thing? It's a good thing to be a lawyer. It's a good thing for me to be a good lawyer. I want that on my tombstone, and so forth and so on. So yeah, you can think about it in all sort of ways. The way Pat suggested is perfectly good.
Jack, I've got a lot of questions. I want to make sure that students have a chance to ask any questions that they may have about anything that we've talked about. So, normally I would exhaust the big things I want to talk about and then turn it to the student, but I'm not going to do that. I just want to make sure if there are questions that you have a chance to address them, since you're only with us for a brief time. So, do we have any questions for Professor Sammons? Yes, sir.
Practical wisdom that you might have picked up in another career.
Yeah.
Which, of whatever length, how transportable do you think something like that would be into the kind you're talking about?
And Jack, for purposes of the recording, I'm going to repeat the question.
Okay.
So the question is, if you've acquired the practical wisdom from within another practice, described here as a career, but I think you would describe it as a practice, how transportable is that as a lawyer?
Well, it's a damn good question. And one of my complaints, I guess you'd say, about the way we sometimes do legal education is we leave out of legal education all of the things that each one of you individually has brought here. That's a horrible loss, because what you're describing as transportable, I would say, is a matter of translation, of translating what you have learned before into the language of law and the practice of law. And they are. You'll have to be the one to see the connections, but they're clearly there. What was your job before?
IT. I was a computer guy.
Yeah. Well, of course. One of the tricky things about being a computer guy, for example, and many of them do not do this well, is the act of translation. But translating what you understand so that other people can understand it as well. Of not just using your ability to intimidate them. Of not saying, go away, I can do it. You learn that. You learn that that doesn't work. That there's something about being an IT person that requires you to think of this person that you're addressing as a client. And that you're an educator and a counselor, in a sense. Damn, when something goes wrong with my computer, that is a big moment for me. I am emotionally involved with my computer. And when it is screwed up, nothing in the world works well for me until it is fixed. Right? Are we together on this?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So that is what lawyer clients bring to you. Something's going wrong in my work, and it's not going to be right, and they're intense about it until you help me make sense out of it. So my goodness, is that ever translatable into the practice? Yes, of course it is.
Other questions?
Each one of you, by the way, brought something unique and interesting into the practice and into your other courses as well. And got to find a way of the legal education, got to find a way of drawing upon those things better than it does now. One of the problems is that you have a class of 189 people and your classrooms are so large that it's hard to do it that way, but you'll see it arising later on when you get into smaller classes and seminars.
Good questions. Professor Sammons. Yes, sir.
Since the relationship between lawyer and client is so important, do you think there should be some sort of externship requirement where, as a law student, you go out and actually interact with clients?
Should there be an externship requirement for all students?
Ideally, all students should be in clinics. I wouldn't necessarily say externships. I would say each student should be offered and required to take clinical courses. Now, why would I say it that way? Well, externships are hit and miss. You know, Aristotle said you go look around for the person that you admire and you become like that person. That sometimes happens in externships. It often doesn't happen in externships. So you can fall into the wrong mentor and it can ruin it for you. Ideally, that doesn't happen in clinics. That the clinical professor, the one responsible for your learning, is trying to expose you to what's good in the practice, to a meaningful life in the practice, as you're acquiring these abilities. So ideally, that's how it ought to be done, I think. Problem with doing it that way is that it's extremely expensive. And but if an externship, one way of doing externships, a supervised externship, so you're working with a mentor in the practice who has been selected by usually a team of clinicians, and they're involved in supervision of you as well, and they're journaling back and forth and constant conscious thinking, which not only prevents problems from arising, but also speeds up the process of your learning. So that would be, for me, the ideal way of going about it. Yeah. Good questions. But you damn sure should. You know, one thing that people have stopped doing that they used to do all the time is go down to the courthouse. You know, I mean, I know you're busy folks and so forth, hard to do in the first year, but get the court calendar, go down and watch trials. Or get to know some of the local lawyers and ask if you can come sit in for a while. Doesn't have to be a formal arrangement. Be good to see a whole bunch of them. This course does a bit of that by bringing in a bunch of different kinds of lawyers. Yes, sir.
Given the reason for these courses, like the decline of professionalism, you know, the concern that some judges have, and the tension between that and say Aristotle's, you need to look and find virtuous people to develop virtues.
Right.
How do we take what we've learned here and continue it once we get out? Because again, it seems like the problem is outside of the classroom.
How do you take what you learn in this class and apply it if the profession itself says professionalism has declined?
The crucial moment is right now, because the initial formation of your ideal is right now. This is when the worst mistakes are made. The one thing that you all share, you're all very different people, and you come from different backgrounds and the like. The one thing that you all shared when you came to law school is, and I could ask each one of you, and you'd say, well, I want this, this, and this, and then this what I want. And each one of you would say, I want to be a good lawyer. You really wouldn't make sense to come here without thinking that you want to be a good lawyer. If you ask anyone when they're starting off in baseball, they say, I want to be a good ball player. There's something about us that makes us want to do things well. Now is when you are acquiring your understanding of what it means to do it well. So the crucial time is now. And the time when you get out is the time to start modifying what you've learned, challenging what you've learned, using it as a judgment about the people that you're seeing and the like. So it's obviously an ongoing process. I think if it's done well in law school, it's one of the reasons for the course. You've actually maybe articulated a better reason for the course than I did before. If you've done it well in law school, I think it's going to come quite naturally to you. My concern before was that when you were just having the regular types of courses that were generally unrelated to the practice itself, and the way that this one is, then it was just hit or miss. And the first lawyer you bumped into, you'd say, well, that person seems to know what they're doing. That must be it. Yeah. That helped.
Lifetime endeavor.
For sure.
Other questions? Jack, they're going to leave me time to ask
Okay.
One last question, and you've got about 3 minutes to answer it. And it's a question I think might not make any sense to Aristotle, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Okay. We talked about all these virtues and what it means to be a good lawyer and how they take you to that and so on. Why should they give a damn? Why should they care about acquiring those virtues for themselves? Why should they care?
Yeah. For selfish reasons. It was important to me in thinking about this that it be for selfish reasons. Because then it applied to everybody. You hear what I'm saying? It applied to everybody when it was for selfish reasons. If we could approach the task in a way that made sense in terms of your own life, and I think most of you would agree that you'd like to have a life well lived. I think most of you would agree that a component of life well lived is finding meaning in your work. Okay, finding meaning within the work that you do.
And Daisy Floyd has described that as intrinsic rewards, whereas McIntyre would say internal.
Yeah, the internal goods of a practice are the goods of doing something well. So if I'm playing chess and I make a clever move, that's a reward to me. It's not a reward that's in competition with other people, like winning the game might be, or like fame or fortune or power and money and so forth and so on. The internal goods are that. Expanding from that is the broader notion of eudaimonia, of the life well lived, and of finding meaning in your work. One of the rewards is the meaning of your work. That's a selfish thing. Now, there are other ways of meaning. Some come into the practice, and that's why that phrase, finding it in the work, or often, it finds you rather than you finding it, because it's very much of an acquired thing, just like it might be in chess. Or it might be in my son is a composer, it might be in composing music. You suddenly, through your own work, discover the meaning of it. I think it happens to people that way more than it does in any other way. But there are other ways of doing it. And the key tension for me was, no, I want to use lawyer for good. And use my own lawyering to do good. I want to do social service. I want to help the poor. I want to solve the world's problems. There's nothing wrong with that. Nothing at all wrong with that. It's admirable in the life. But that's using the practice in another way. And even in those types of ways of using the practice, you have to find a meaning in the work itself for a life well lived. So I didn't want to exclude anyone and wanted to find a way that would apply to everyone, regardless of the kind of practice that you might be in, where you can find meaning in.
Selfish reasons.
Selfish reasons. Yeah.
Jack, I'm really sorry to say we're out of time, but I always learn something when we talk, and so thank you for being here.